Welcome back to Beyond the Surface. This is our second episode. Thank you if you tuned in last time, and hello if you are new. I'm Quinton Mandel.
I'm Jean-Marie Onvroch. We're both registered counselors, and today we explore what lies beneath addiction, trauma, and healing. Just a quick note, any names that we use in today's podcast are either fictional or have been changed to protect people's privacy.
Today we're diving into something quiet but powerful. How autism, especially what's called high function autism, can intersect with substance use, often as a way to cope.
And I think this is such a great topic that we're discussing today because there's so little information on it. I myself am a mom of a teen on the high end of the spectrum, and it's an area that is often very misunderstood. There's often this misconception that there's a lack of discipline, and sometimes autism is viewed as rebellion, but it's actually a form of regulation. It's not self destruction, but it's a way for that individual to feel safe in a world that is not built for people on the spectrum. So, this conversation today is specifically for professionals, loved ones, and anyone who is silently navigating this terrain. But first, let's define our term simply. So, autism spectrum disorder, or what we commonly call ASD, means someone's brain processes sensory input, their emotions, and social signals differently. There's no cure for ASD, and the exact cause is still largely unknown.
When we say high functioning autism, we mean someone who may be good at school or work, but still faces challenges in social interactions. And many times these children or adults, they experience a sensory overload and they battle usually in their life with emotional regulation.
And you bring up such an important point there that the high functioning autism, often these individuals have learned how to mask. So this means that they are trying to fit into a neurotypical world and they've learned how to cope with others in conversation. They've maybe learned to smile when they feel anxious. They've maybe been forced to make eye contact and they learn to hide their true feelings just to fit in. But long term, this can be extremely damaging.
I have a great example of masking from a school setting. Kyle is a teen I worked with who really struggled to cope, not just with academics, but with the entire school environment and the social dynamics. He had a hard time fitting in. Through our sessions, he shared. He actually plans every conversation in his head before speaking. He would rehearse jokes and even avoid eye contact, just so others wouldn't stare at him. But every day he came home completely drained, tired and emotionally exhausted. He started vaping and drinking to try and manage the anxiety. And that's the point where coping turned into dependence.
So, why do you think some people with autism turn then to substances?
I think number one is definitely sensory overload. Bright lights, confusing social cues. Just being at a party can feel overwhelming. I remember back in school, even just going to a party or getting through the day felt overwhelming. So imagine that amplified. For someone with autism, their sensory system is often on high alert. I always compare it to animals, like my cat. When I turn the music up loud, she runs out the room. I imagine people with autism might have similar experiences with sensory input. It is just too much. It's too much. What feels normal for us can feel intense or even unbearable to them. And because our senses and emotions are so connected, that constant sensory input can lead to emotional overload. From there, it's easy to get stuck in your head, overthinking, overfeeling, and trying to regulate in a way possible. Let me give you an example of Sarah. She hated the chaos of college residence. She couldn't sleep because of the noise and constant stimulation. Therefore, as a coping mechanism, she started using alcohol just to calm down and to mute the chaos. It started as a way to cope. It became something she relied on every night just to fall asleep. So that automatically creates the potential for addiction. What other examples do you have, John Marie?
Well, I can imagine that Sarah must have maybe then just to function the next day in terms of class, she must have felt extremely fatigued. And so I think anybody suffering on the autism spectrum, pretending to be something that you're not all day or pretending to cope all day must be extremely exhausting. So I think the substances then offer them temporary relief through that. So there was a young man named Aaron who started experimenting with marijuana at home just to feel calmer. And soon it became part of his routine, just doing it alone to reset. I think even a history of trauma, often they're exposed to bullying at school. There's misunderstandings. Your neurotypical people don't always understand why they behave in a certain way, why they don't want to make eye contact. They can sometimes sound very monotone in the way they speak. They don't always react the way that people typically expect them to react. And the rejection can lead to emotional pain that the substances sort of numb and take the edge off of. And then in terms of autism, it anyway comes with repetitive behavior. Addictions like gaming, where there is a lot of repetition, can easily become a form of an addictive behavior for them. And if they try substances once and they repeat it, they increase the risk to become dependent.
Why do you think that they become so easily dependent on that?
I think because it's a way for them often to feel normal
Hmm?
and to maybe fit in with a confusing world, especially if they feel so overwhelmed sensory wise. Often they think that, your autistic individuals won't develop a substance dependency because it heightens your senses.
Mhm.
But a lot of the drugs, such as marijuana or alcohol, which are more your kind of downers and hallucinogens, take the edge off, which I think is appealing to them. And a lot of them, if they're undiagnosed, they tend to self medicate.
Yeah, I hear you. Interesting.
So research shows actually that 1 in 44 children are diagnosed with ASD, and many adults, as I've mentioned, are undiagnosed or they only get diagnosed later in life. And then we also have your females and your LGBTQ and your youth that often learn from a young age to fit in. They often present differently in terms of the symptoms, so they often aren't diagnosed. Even your Black, Indigenous, or people of color individuals, they might feel pressure to hide in order to feel safe or to avoid being judged. So they then camouflage their autistic traits. And this takes huge emotional effort. And this chronic self suppression leads to exhaustion, anxiety, depression, and then sometimes substance use. So these groups have historically faced multiple layers of discrimination, such as gender bias, homophobia, transphobia, racism. They're often rejected socially, they often are bullied, or they come from unsafe environments.
Hmm.
And this adds to their mental load and creates a very complex trauma environment, which makes it then even harder to cope already with their sensory activities, their emotions that are already overwhelming, and the social confusion that's common in ASD.
Wow, that's interesting. I also know there's a study which has been done by General Hospital, which found that 1 in 5 young adults seeking help for substance use had autistic traits that had not been diagnosed. And many didn't even know why they felt different. So it's very much like you mentioned now.
And there's other studies that suggest autistic people may not use substances as often, but if they do tend to become dependent more quickly due to repetition and the way their brain are wired. One participant who I worked with said that they found rehab was really overwhelming. The lights, the noise, sometimes the forced group hugs, having to interact in large social groups. Others described that they felt too sensitive or it was too intense, and that shame kept them hidden. And because many are high function, their pain is often overlooked because they look as if they're coping. People might not notice that they're struggling. So the services we currently have are built largely for neurotypical individuals. It's group therapy, it's bright rooms, it's fast schedules, but a lot of autistic clients just find these kind of settings simply unbearable.
What I think is really missing is that most therapist training rarely includes autism in the context of addiction treatment. Autistic clients may hear things like, you don't look autistic, or you're too smart to struggle with addiction. Very few people, and even fewer therapists, truly understand autism, which makes it even more difficult for autistic individuals to cope within addiction treatment settings.
It might actually encourage them to mask even further because somebody has mentioned they don't look autistic or that they don't present the way that they typically expect someone on the spectrum to present. And that invisibility doubles the isolation.
I believe the real solution is co-designing programs with autistic people, not just for them. When autistic individuals are meaningfully involved in building these programs, they not only gain a sense of ownership and dignity, but the solutions become more authentic, respectful, and truly supportive of their needs.
That is such an important point that you've brought up, that including them, I think, is really the answer, because they're the ones who can best say what they find they need and what works for them. And we also need to offer sensory sensitive therapies for them. So instead of maybe larger groups, more one on one peer support, and options like art, music, or somatic work instead of your more verbal work.
Most definitely. I also think it's important to train therapists in dual diagnosis. You and I previously discussed how there's a strong link between autism and depression, autism and anxiety, and clearly autism and addiction. We've also explored in this podcast there's a clear connection between autism and trauma.
I think it's what makes it even more challenging sometimes to treat is that dual diagnosis.
I think many of these individuals feel like outsiders, not just socially, but existentially. And for them, substance use often becomes a bridge to feeling alive, just like you've mentioned before.
And I think healing happens when the world accepts your difference without pressuring you to conform. Often I've had someone say to me, if you can just teach someone with autism to be neurotypical, and that's not the answer. If they could be neurotypical, they wouldn't be on the spectrum. So it's really how do we accommodate them in a neurotypical world?
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that true integration means accepting sensitivity as strength, not weakness.
Absolutely. And if anything that we've said today in this podcast echoes with you, no, it's not a flaw, but it's an adaptation.
And remember, you're not broke. You just learned how to survive. Healing is possible when you reclaim your worth.
And whether you were listening today as a therapist, as a parent, or a person who finds himself on this path, remember that your journey really matters.
Thanks for joining us for this episode, Beyond the Surface. Until next time, stay kind, stay conscious, and stay curious.